And while we're transitioning, and you can see this flurry of activity, I'll take this opportunity to thank the good folks here at the Pew Charitable Trust. We have held a number of events here in the past several years, and we keep coming back time and time again because it's such a great venue, and kind of the staff is so great. And this is like a pit stop in the world of convening, changing the mics like this. And so it's good to know that we're in good hands. So we like to thank our colleagues here at Pew. Okay, and we're kind of moving out of the pits here. So the next session is titled Latino Experience, Past, Present, and Future. And if you look across the day, I think we're going to see, kind of moving from this session to the next session in particular, going from some kind of big picture, kind of broad context of the Latino population's experience as it works into education, and then really in the afternoon kind of looking at kind of the more local reform level, kind of what are the programs and strategies and places where this is all working out. And so we've got a great lineup here, and kind of Leslie will do the introductions, and I think we're going to get a real 360 on the issues. We're going to be able to talk about these issues from an educational perspective, demographic perspective, kind of economic, as well as kind of policy and politics, which are all extremely important here. And our guests here are in very good hands with our moderator, Lesli Maxwell. She's a staff writer, Education Week. Leslie, had been in Education Week and then left, and she had to come back, which we always like. And so she's had experience actually outside of the reporting world. She's a veteran reporter, has worked a lot on covering districts, and now you may know her from her work on ELL and language policies, and she is the author of our Learning Language blog, as well as the lead writer in this year's report. So Leslie, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. We've got a great lineup here, as Chris said, and so we'll get right to the introduction so we can start the conversation. We have Richard Fry with us. Richard is a senior research associate at the Pew Hispanic Center here in Washington. Dr. Fry he's a demographic economist with expertise in analyzing education and demographic data, as well as describing in great detail the characteristics of racial, ethnic, and immigrant populations in the U.S. Next to him is Sarita Brown. She is the founding president of Excelencia in Education, a national nonprofit here in Washington that advocates for Latino success in higher education. Ms. Brown served in the Clinton administration. She was the executive director of the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans. And for 15 years, she was in the higher ed space directly. She was at the University of Texas, Austin in various capacities, including the assistant graduate dean and the founding director of the Graduate Opportunity Program. And next to Sarita is Raul Gonzalez. He is the director of legislative affairs for the National Council of La Raza, a civil rights and advocacy organization based here in Washington. Before joining NCLR, Mr. Gonzalez was on the Hill as a legislative aide to a U.S. congressman. And prior to that, he was a teacher in the New York City public schools. And Ana Sol Gutierrez is currently serving in the Maryland House of Delegates. She represents the 18th District in southern Montgomery County. Ms. Gutierrez is our resident scientist on the panel. She's a chemist and computer systems engineer. She served as a deputy administrator in the U.S. Department of Transportation during the Clinton administration. And she also spent 8 years on the Montgomery County Board of Education. All right, so let's get rolling here. We're going to start with you, Richard. If you could sort of, we've had some of the introduction to who the Latino population is, their size, but if you could kind of take us through the growth over time, where this population is headed in terms of growth, and why their success in education is so important to the rest of society and the American workforce.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Earlier, Dr. Swanson sort of showed the population projections, and I could frame it that way. And I could also sort of discuss why education is particularly valuable for Latinos themselves. The framework I'm going to do, though, is more from a business perspective, from the perspective of employers and our nation's labor force. Projecting the labor force is a tricky game, and I won't go into the details of what needs to be assumed. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, though, is willing to pursue that. And what we see going from 2011 to, I'm going to take it out to 2050, is the non-Hispanic white labor force, just in terms of sheer numbers, okay? It's not going to grow. It's actually going to fall a little bit. In the BLS projections, there's two groups that are going to be rapidly growing. The nation's Hispanic labor force and also the nation's Asian labor force. But in terms of actual numbers, most of the action in terms of millions is the nation's Hispanic labor force. Presently, in terms of the labor force, those working or looking for work, Hispanics are about 15% of the labor force, about 23 million. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, by 2050, the Hispanic labor force will basically double in size up to about 47 million, and they'll go from 15% of the labor force to about 24% of the labor force. So in terms of labor force, it's not quite as stunning as sort of talking about the public school population or the share of births or even the share of population, because the labor force should go from about age 16 up to, into the 70s and 80s. But it's a little bit of an older dynamic. But still, by 2050, 1 out of 4 workers will be of Latino Hispanic origin. And so from a business perspective, okay, it's hard to see right now in the depths of sort of the Great Recession and its recovery, but we are a growing population relative to many European and other advanced countries. We are a growing economy, and we're going to need additional workers. And a big part of those extra workers will be Latino and Hispanic. And so that's from the standpoint of not just Latinos themselves, but our tax base, supporting our elderly retiring workers, okay, much of the action for the nation's business community in terms of the extra workers we're going to need will be Latino.
Very good. Well, Sarita, jumping off of that, given where we're headed in terms of the labor force, what needs to happen both at the K-12 level and at the higher education level to ensure that these young Latinos get the access they need to college and that they complete the degree? Where are the biggest levers for change here?
Pursue many of the good ideas that are featured in this publication. Act as if this is a doable deed. Become uncomfortable with the chronic nature of the discussion about achievement gaps and lower rates of academic achievement. As you heard from my introduction, I have been at this a long time. And 30 years ago, we predicted the state of affairs that our country now is experiencing. And yet, we've been very comfortable living through these 30 years with increasing numbers of Latino students, families, the opportunity to engage, the opportunity to use well-tested strategies in terms of English language learners, how to deal with the mitigation of children who are growing up in poverty, how to address the whole question of college knowledge, the fact that when you unpack these statistics, more often than not, you see the byproduct of the educational levels of parents, particularly mothers, being able to communicate with their children from a very early age. Yes, you're going to college. Here's where you're going to go. Here's how you're going to get financial aid. We've known for a long time that that kind of information can be delivered in many different ways, but we've yet to really deploy it. And because of this very chronic quality to the problem solving and the absence of the use of solutions, I really do want to applaud Education Week. I want to applaud the Lumina Foundation. I think that today's release and the kind of systemic, overarching approach that you've taken is a model for what we really need to start to do as it relates to policy making and to solution building. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to participate in a committee meeting that was called by a group of senators looking at the whole question of college affordability. And it was a very fruitful discussion. It was very purposeful. It was entertaining innovative ideas. But one of the things that I have a habit of mind whenever I approach such a discussion, and particularly in the echo of the kind of data that we've just heard, is if we're talking about the future, then let's look at who we're talking about. Let's actually begin a discussion about the potential solutions against the trend lines that we've seen. So if we know that the majority of the students, not just Latino, but that the majority of students that our systems, K-12 and post-secondary, right now really labor to serve, are first-generation students, then we really need to begin with that premise that it is the system that has to be a source of information. I will not belabor the point, because I know that in later sessions you're going to be hearing about innovative models. But the premise that we have when we approach these kinds of discussions is that the system as it is, baseline, is good, and we just have to make marginal changes. The system is one that is ready for change for everyone. The use of online education, the use of social media, the recognition that what goes on outside the classroom in high school as well as in college, these have been talked about. Now we have to move to solutions. And then, because Excelencia in Education has been mentioned as a source of promising practices, everything that's already out there, that's been vetted, everything that you have that's a strategy with ample data, hold people accountable for that knowledge when they start to talk about solutions.
Raul, we're going to go to you now and pivot a little bit to talk about what's happening in the policy arena, especially at the federal level where you deal. What kind of deliberate attention, if any, are Latino students and their needs getting among policymakers, particularly in the current discussions around ESEA reauthorization, the waivers from No Child Left Behind, the current version of ESEA, Race to the Top, some of the other big initiatives of the Obama administration on education?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel and for especially putting out this report. It's an important report because it's something that we've been working towards for a long time, which is to get some more attention on this group of kids, and I think the report does an excellent job of that. Well, in thinking about the attention that folks are paying to Latinos, it's something that is new for a lot of folks, and as Chris has mentioned, there's been a decade of education reform that's been taking place, very unpopular reform for many folks. But the fact is that after a generation, a decade of this reform and No Child Left Behind, we've seen some improvements. And part of the improvement is the fact that people are forced to pay attention. The fact is that people have known a lot of these stats before. It just didn't matter. And so the fact that we had a decade of a reform that said it does matter, we're going to make it matter, and you're going to be held accountable for the education of these kids, it's made a difference. It's an inelegant policy. We all know the law is by no means perfect or even close to it, but the fact is it did force people to pay attention, and that's a starting point. And the important question for policy is, where do we go from here? Now that we've got your attention, what do we do? Well, I'll start with what's not going to happen, which is ESEA. It's not going to happen. We know that. We've known that for a while, and it's unfortunate because it's a missed opportunity. ESEA is the nation's, it's the federal imprimatur as far as where the education system should go, and it's too bad that we can't, come together to reauthorize this law that's been bipartisan throughout all its history. So ESEA is not going to happen, and it's a missed opportunity. It might be good that it's not going to pass because the proposals coming out of Congress are really not that great. With No Child Left Behind, we've had a decade of, driving reform at 120 miles an hour, down the highway, texting at the same time, and maybe a little drunk. So it's been a little dangerous. But the response to that in the real world is to stop someone, pull them over, give them a sobriety test. But in the area of reform, we can't stop this car. We have to slow it down. We have to make sure that it's getting everything right. But we can't stop this car from moving forward, and that's what's coming out of Congress. It's just stop this. And that's wrong. We do see the administration taking some steps to move the ball forward. And that's important, and these are things we need to watch. And for example, the administration has moved forward with the Early Learning Challenge Fund, which provides resources to states, hundreds of millions of dollars to states to align their preschool systems to get better outcomes, and focusing on ELLs and Latino kids is part of that. It's important to watch that because states have, they have the primary responsibility to execute this program. When we think about Race to the Top, and now the school district-based Race to the Top, again, there's lots of opportunities there to focus on kids of color, low-income kids, and ELLs. But again, it's up to states and districts. And so it's something to watch, but there's going to be lots of reform activities that are happening. It's important to watch them. And when we talk about waivers, that's the de facto policy of the land right now. And there's some important elements there for Latino kids and ELLs. One is states have to adopt and start to implement the Common Core or college-ready standards, and that's huge. I mean, if anyone is against college-ready Common Core standards, I need to understand why you would be. Basically, it's saying that every kid in every school in every state has to have a curriculum that prepares them for college. Who can be against that? And these are state-led reforms. And so it's important to watch to make sure that states implement this well and include Latino and ELL kids. And they have to. I mean, under the waiver system, you have to say whether or not you're going to adopt, for example, English language proficiency standards. And that's huge because that helps us to move the ball forward with ELL kids. And you know, the last piece I'll say is regarding college. I mean, we're at a crossroads, and folks have mentioned this already as far as college and the cost of college. You know, college has traditionally been a way for someone to get out of poverty, climb into the middle class, and then keep moving up the economic ladder. That may no longer be the case, simply because of cost. If you are a kid from a low-income family or a middle-class family, you have to make a choice. Am I going to be able to buy a house, or am I going to go to college? Because if you are working class, middle class, you're going to leave college with so much debt that you can't buy a house, right? And if you're affluent, your parents will help you either with college or with a house. And so this is unsustainable. And so that's where we really need some robust policy making and some movement with regard to college.
Thank you. Well, Anna, you're a state legislator, and I know that the dropout issue for Latino students has long been on your radar screen, first as a school board member and as a legislator now. What sort of progress have you seen at the local and state level with regard to graduation rates for Latinos, and what still needs to be done?
Oh my, I'm sorry. I guess it's still on, yes. Well, let me first thank you, Ed Week, Chris, the Lumina Foundation, because I wish that back in 1990, 98, when I served on the school board, I could have had this kind of information. We have made progress in, as you pointed out, at least reporting the data, focusing, getting much better information. But I personally don't see working on the ground with public policymakers, initially at the local level and now at the state level. We are not really focusing and making the kind of reforms that are going to help Latino students. And that's why I really think that this issue should be mandatory reading for any policymaker. It does highlight not only the data, but the diversity of the population is not a monolithic population. The success and perhaps the data shows the failures of dealing with students. I think states need to look at what are potentials within their policy for doing reform, but probably more important is at the local level, because that's where you really see the different opportunities to be making difference. I'm not really a great believer of the national kind of policies because they don't really get down to the ground to where the student is and where it needs to happen. I saw that myself serving on a school board and now at the state level. We have a very successful district, Montgomery County, Maryland. It's huge, according to the figures here, but it has had, since a very long time, this growing change in the demographics. It has made a significant effort. I wouldn't say it's because it's targeted these students, but because it has been trying to improve the overall educational effort. It's very wealthy, so it has the ability to invest in top-notch teachers, top-notch curriculum, top-notch buildings. And so kind of a trickle-down effect. You see it in the data that we are, as Latinos, getting better graduation rates. But I don't see that there has been really a conscious effort from a policy perspective to say, oh my goodness, we need to see really what are the needs for the students. When we're talking about dropouts, not all dropouts are the same. What is causing kids to drop out? You need to be able to focus. Later on, I think we're going to be talking about the early childhood initiatives that are important here. Those are absolutely important for us to tailor it to this population. So I guess another point that I want to make is at the state level, there is very little focus on this population because the population is not distributed throughout the state of Maryland, for example, and there are districts that couldn't care less. The numbers are small, but the politics are also kind of what we're seeing reflected in the anti-immigrant policies. And so we're not seeing a consistent state priority and a focus on developing the kind of supports and systems that we need. So policy is fragmented, it's not really focused. More than anything, there's almost a reluctance to deal seriously with this population. This report hopefully is going to make some difference because right now I think pulling teeth is easier than really making a difference on our Latino students.
We're going to come back to you, Richard, and talk on a little deeper level about who these children are in our schools. As Anna said, they're not a monolithic group. They have a wide range of differences and characteristics, as well as some similarities. If you could sort of describe for us who these kids are, what their language abilities are, how they're the same, how they're different, and increasingly where are they living across the country?
Focusing first, this came up in our earlier discussion. Hispanic children are tricky because you're all adults, and so you interact with other Hispanic adults. And so we form our impressions of Hispanic children by our observations of the wider Hispanic population or Hispanic adults. And that basically leads you down false paths. When we look at Hispanic either children or public school students, largely the same, only 10% of them are foreign-born themselves, immigrants. 9 out of 10 Hispanic kids is US born. And in terms of sort of direct immigration policy, of the 10% that are immigrants, the Pew Hispanic Center estimates that about 70% of them are undocumented. So about 7% of Hispanic children are unauthorized or undocumented. 93% are authorized, many of them are citizens US born. there's the biggest piece of Hispanic children is what's called the second generation. A little over half of Hispanic children are second generation. What that means is they're US born of one or more immigrant parents. Now, the Pew Hispanic Center estimates that of that little over half of the second generation kids, okay, about 21% of them have one or more undocumented parents. So 7% of the kids are undocumented themselves. Another 21% have a parent or parents that are unauthorized and so live under the sort of the threat of deportation. So roughly you're looking at about 30%, 28% of Latino children that sort of where immigration policy, deportation policy directly comes into play. That's much smaller than the Hispanic population in general or Hispanic adults. And so issues of immigration policy for Hispanic children, they don't loom as large. In terms of sort of language ability, this is an area where I've learned over the past 10 years where even just in terms of data, we need to do a better job. And in terms of sort of language abilities, when you look at sort of Hispanic children, from Census Bureau data, we know that about a third of them, 30%, close to about a third, are English monolinguals. They do not speak Spanish at home. They are monolingual, they are English only, and they know English stellarly. Okay? Then there's about 2/3 where Spanish is spoken at home. And the question particularly is, for those that speak Spanish, how many of them are bilingual and know English as well? And it turns out, I've discovered that Census Bureau data can sort of lead you astray on this because Census Bureau data focuses on speaking ability. But you're familiar with education, and in education, the status that you use is an English language learner. Not just sort of speaking ability, but having sufficiently good English skills in reading and writing in order to do academic classroom-style English. And on that, I'm sorry, state of California actually has been collecting pretty good data, but nationwide, we really do not collect good data on our English language learners in terms of sort of, is their second language Spanish? Is it sort of, what's their race ethnicity? And that's been very difficult, and Census Bureau data doesn't really help you with that. I am glad to say that the NAEP, reflecting increased emphasis on English language learners, NAEP is now, it's the gold standard in many ways, and now we actually are getting through the NAEP, nationally representative sample of schools. The Department of Education takes great care of this data product, and I was surprised, relative to sort of Census Bureau statistics, more Hispanic children are indeed English language learners than what the Census Bureau statistics would show. Most recent NAEP, among Hispanic fourth graders, 38% are designated English language learners. So again, there is a significant chunk of Hispanic fourth graders that are dealing with the issues of English language acquisition. Okay? Many of them are going to learn English quite well by the time they're in their teenage years, finish high school. For example, by the time in NAEP you get to 8th grade, 20% of Hispanic 8th graders are English language learners. But this is of concern because when we sort of go in and look at the NAEP scores, okay, more so than all Hispanics or more so than all African Americans, let's say, just in terms of averages, I tend to focus on math, less on reading, but in terms of math, as a group, this includes some Asian English language learners as well. ELLs are a diverse group, not just Hispanic, but again, on average, nationally, they tend to score below average Hispanics or average African Americans. And so this English language learner status, this is a group of learners that even once they master English, we know that in terms of all the other challenges they face, finishing high school, being college ready, they need great attention.
Well, so Rita, that's a good jumping off point to come back to you to talk more specifically about the challenges particular to Latino students in getting into college. compared to some of the other major racial and ethnic groups. What are some of those barriers and challenges? And I also want you to come back to the whole affordability issue, to talk about that and how the way the current financial aid system is, the way it's structured, how it affects Latino students.
I do think, particularly following Rick's animated presentation about English language learners, that one of the challenges is that as a country we are so conflicted about language that rather than employ strategies that are well tested worldwide about language being an asset, about using a student's strength, whatever it may be, and bring it into the classroom, we have a tendency to treat language as a proxy for loyalty to the country. And so I think that we should look for those school districts, those school buildings where language is simply a factor, and then hold up those practices. But so I was motivated by you, Rick. But in terms of what we know about college going, the issues of finance is very pervasive in even the dreaming for many children and their families. The question of how to use the resources that are available and then actually how to secure the kind of financing to go to college, and what that then does to students' understanding of where they can even go. I mean, we come at the use of data in a very practical kind of way. The co-founder of Excelencia in Education, Deborah Santiago, has basically taken large data sets and brought us to a point where, in a discussion about strategies and solutions, we look at what currently goes on among Latino students. So the majority of Latino college goers are first-generation college goers. And what that means is that their interaction with any institution that they're applying to has a particular need in terms of information. There's so much about the way colleges and universities do their outreach, recruit or don't recruit, that is pitched at a level in terms of its discussions with potential applicants and their families that just assumes a whole lot about what a very bright, motivated student knows. If you've never been to college, if your parents haven't been to college, you really don't know, just off the top of your head, what is the difference between a community college and a baccalaureate granting institution? What is the difference in terms of private institutions and public institutions? Something that's very hot right now. What is the difference between a for-profit institution and a not-for-profit institution? And that whole discussion really, when we talk about it in policy circles, still has a sound to it as if we're blaming the students, as if they need to get with the program and know this stuff. Well, it's not easy. And when we look at the data trend lines, what we see is legacy kinds of issues in terms of middle-class families are able to get their high school students to the point that they are quite savvy about, I go to the best institution I've been admitted to, this is the kind of financial aid I do, what kind of scholarship do I get, and so I don't have to take out loans. But taking that kind of information and presenting it early and often in ways that Latino students, first-generation students, can begin to incorporate in their strategizing, that's a challenge. The other is that for many Latino students, the choice of where they go to school is made, that navigation is made based on what they know in terms of their lives. So again, it's this issue of finance, but also familiarity. If you look at the college enrollment patterns for Latino students, the majority will enroll within 50 miles of where they grow up. Now, yes, we are close to our families, and yes, we go home, all those things are true, but more often it's because that's what we know. And that's an environment in which we can navigate working part-time, which educational research will tell us is not what we should be doing, and living at home as opposed to living on campus. So when we look at those data points, what we see is something that is very malleable. It's something that we know how to begin to intervene early and how to provide information so that students can maximize the system. But what we also see is a policy construction and a discussion about who's going to change and how that continues to put the responsibility at the feet of these new students and their families, rather than, now I'll go back up to where we begin, an economic discussion or a large-scale human capital discussion. I mean, if we really were functioning as if we believed that the Latino proportion of the American society really is our future workforce, really is our future civic leadership, we would not be basically abandoning or leaving them alone to figure it out on their own until you're ready for prime time, which is the system which already exists. That's the dynamic that we're having to confront. And we do it as activists, whether we're journalists, whether we're teachers, whether we're policymakers. But the actual deployment of what this kind of data would imply in terms of change, that's the part that we would like to see a very pragmatic use of not only the data points, but the solutions that have already been identified and that are daily being identified. And the basically challenging each other. I mean, one way of advocating is to call out those who stink at their job. And at Excelencia, we instead choose to call out and praise, give high praise to those that despite the economy, that despite the challenge, are able to produce those results. I know that this gathering has such individuals and that will be speaking to us later, but for anyone who is looking at that kind of information, every year Excelencia in Education engages in examples of Excelencia. We would want you to know those programs, and we would want you as people of influence to really wrestle with the question, why isn't that going on in my community? Why aren't the school districts and post-secondary institutions that are where I live performing like that?
Okay. We're going to shift to the early years, the other end of the educational spectrum for a few minutes. And Raul, I'd like to ask you to talk to us a little bit. I mean, we know that Latino children as a group are less likely to participate in preschool than their Black, white, and Asian peers. Why is that? And what are the longer term implications of this?
Sure. Before I get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about the college piece. I think one of the issues that we haven't really hit on is the fact that the cost of college is increased at a rate similar to cost of healthcare. And when people talk about that, they talk about unsustainability and being out of reach. And that's where we're getting with college. And the thing is, the four-year colleges and graduate schools and law schools produce the leadership of this country. And so, we need to think about who's going to be our future leaders. And are we going to have a group of folks that are going to be in the workforce, not earning a lot, or maybe earning a lot, but not being leaders in this country? That's a problem, and I think we need to face, and colleges need to face up to the fact that maybe they're charging too much and making it, that might be the biggest barrier that we'll face one day if we do everything right in pre-K through 12. So that's, I think, something people should think about. When we talk about preschool, it's been an ongoing issue as far as Latinos being underrepresented in preschool. It's getting better. The Head Start law has passed. The last reauthorization had some changes which would help kind of incentivize people to serve these kids. But the biggest issue, I would say there's two issues. One is location. When Head Start started, that was the major preschool movement. And those preschool centers were not in Latino communities. And they still tend to serve predominance of preschool kids. And not a lot of school districts and other in the states have preschool opportunities. And so location is an issue. And so we need to deal with location. And I think we're getting a little better at that. The other issue is quality. And people talk about quality education, and starting at preschool, there's a lot of elements to that. And if you're a parent bringing a very young child to a center, where you're going to trust adults to deal with your child. One thing people think about is, well, I don't understand what this person's saying. And so language is an issue. If you have a parent who doesn't speak English as a first language and you don't have someone able to talk to that person, to talk about the program, what's going to happen to your child once you go to work and leave him or her here, then that's a challenge. The other is around quality with regard to services to the child, and people in preschool centers having some expertise in second language development, as well as cultural competency to work with very young children whose parents don't speak English, but also some of whom might come from households, as Richard mentioned, where the parent is an immigrant and the child is US born. And so these are different ways to think about quality that I think people need to think about in order to really to market the preschool system a lot better to Latinos.
And Anna, I want to stay on the preschool topic with you for a second to talk a little bit about why, what the benefits for these children to be in preschool in greater numbers.
Well, I think clearly what we've been talking about for many years is the gaps, closing the achievement gap. Well, it starts way before you enter kindergarten. That's why the importance now, and for me, the next big thing is to really, really provide the opportunities for early language, early childhood education. I think we're giving it lip service. We're certainly not spending the public dollars to provide sufficient slots, because one of the primary reasons why a lot of low-income Latinos don't go to a preschool, simply they can't afford it. Daycare is probably one of the most expensive things in the United States right now. So we need to invest more public dollars for that. But I think the quality of the daycare has to change from what we currently are looking at quality daycare for English-speaking students, to look at the children that are really born speaking another language. They're US born, and I think your data, to me, is appalling in a certain way, that because we're not doing a good job in early childhood education, you're getting a fourth grader who is still ELL when they've been speaking. How old is a fourth grader? 6, 7, 10, 8 years old? That shouldn't be. That should never be. We are not taking advantage of that language that the child is bringing into that kindergarten and building on it for language development. We have brain research that says that it absolutely makes a child a better learner or more intelligent simply because they're exposed to 2 different languages. Why are we not building on that language as an asset? I was in a conference with a academic from Nebraska who will remain nameless, who called coming to school with another language other than English a risk factor. It was a negative, it was a detriment. Put these kids already in a negative aspect. And if you multiply that 12 years, where expectations, where access to quality education is limited, you're going to keep on seeing those gaps continually growing. And I think that much of where we are, what we're seeing, is not a one-time issue, but really accumulation of how these children are viewed upon, how they're marginalized. I'm working, and I've been working for 12 years with a nonprofit that I chair to reduce tracking. If we get rid of what are institutional tracking mechanisms in our public schools, sorting kids into the gifted and the non-gifted, so many Latinos are really not being given the opportunities. And just as a final closing point, I do want to add something to the college. We have our state budgets with enormous amount of money going to higher ed. It's being paid by all the taxpayers in our state. However, those who benefit, and in Maryland, we've kept tuition frozen for the last 6 years. Who benefits? Not Latino students because they're not being recruited because of all the things that Sarita stated. And we've cut community colleges, which is where Latinos go. So somehow we need to really take seriously what it is that we want to have as the future result for Latino students. From what cradle to grave, I think, is the new perspective that we need to take.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So we'll start right here.
Milagros Velez McGuire from the Latino community in Maryland. I have read that the four-year colleges in the U.S. have not increased capacity in any way. Yet, and of course, they are increasing tuition that is totally out of reach of most families. What I would like to know is how can we address this problem? Because I have read that most colleges are accepting lots of Chinese students to their colleges. Why? Because they can pay full tuition. Their government, the Chinese government or the government of China, will subsidize tuition payment in American colleges and universities for their students.
Sarita?
In terms of capacity, I don't know what you have read about not increasing capacity. I believe that at least the public systems that we look at have. But what's also true is that even as they've increased capacity, they can't keep up. California is a perfect example. I mean, as much as budgets allow, they've not only increased classrooms, they've increased hours of meeting, they've increased online, and yet still the CSU has had to turn students away, the community college has turned students away, and you've heard the data. So who is it they're turning away? They're turning away a goodly portion of Latino students. So in that respect, we have a big scale issue. In terms of the perhaps the view that who is being admitted and why, your comment is interesting to someone who has looked at graduate education a long time. That was the work that I did at UT Austin. And that dynamic of the higher proportion by some academic programs, by some institutions to admit international students it is true, and it is particularly true in certain disciplines. And the question of whether or not that's good for the discipline, good for the academy, good for the institution, good for America, I think is a genuine public debate. If we're going to have conversations about immigration, if we're going to have conversations about people who grow up in this country who fundamentally feel like they're they're part of the U.S. society, treated not as such, and we have what appears to be very facilitative structures for people to come and study here and then stay here. All of these things are under discussion. But I do think that the question of accountability, which is fundamentally where this thing will rest. If you're an alumnus of an institution and your campus, your college or university engages in practices like this that you want to comment on, you have every right and you should speak up. As Ana Sol said, I mean, public institutions are state funded. You pay for them with your tax dollars. You should speak up. And I think that we are all going to we are stakeholders, but we're going to be influencers in really what will be the role of higher education going forward. Because what is different now than it was a generation ago is that whatever the jobs are, whatever the career path, whatever the life pattern is that we're imagining, we all really recognize you can't do it with just a high school diploma. Even though this report is about that, you can't. You're talking about, at minimum, an associate's degree. And so the capacity of our country to deliver that, and to deliver it to the fastest growing community in the country, These are going to be very practical, wide-eyed kind of discussions.
Just a couple of things on that. With regard to foreign students, it's important to understand that as a nation, we should have, we should keep in mind that when students come from, particularly from countries that don't have a tradition of democracy, I think we should want those kids to come to our schools and understand what that looks like, because then we're helping to export a sense of democracy. That's important. Second, I think the administration is taking some steps to create some transparency about the value of colleges and the value proposition for students. I think they can go farther than that. For example, kids should know, like for every dollar you're spending, or kids' parents more likely, what are you paying for? Not just what you're getting for, but what are you paying for? So for example, if you're going to a college or university where there's a really great research center, but none of those scientists teach, why should you support that with your tuition dollars? If you have, if a bunch of of your resources are going to support, some sports teams, and you don't really care about sports, why should you pay for that? And this is for state public schools, but also private schools. Kids and their parents should know what they're paying for. Every dollar, what's it going to, and what part of that is accruing benefit to the student and the student's family that's paying for it. People are not telling us the whole truth about what you're paying for, and that's important to know as consumers.
Another question? Over here.
Hi, Shelby McIntosh with the Center on Education Policy, and I have a very specific policy question for you guys. At the center, I manage our research and reporting on high school exit exam policies, and something that's always surprised me is how few of the states that require students to pass an assessment to get a high school diploma offer alternatives or even accommodations for English language learners. And I'm not an expert in policies and the way that they affect English language learners, so from your perspective, is this a good thing that we are holding English language learners in the high schools to the same requirements that we are English speakers, or would you like to see more accommodations, more alternatives offered to this population?
I think it's not just holding the kids accountable, we have to hold the system accountable. If they are not being provided the kind of supports and additional instruction, because especially for those who may have an interrupted education, but again, we're focusing on the new immigrant, but the long-term student that may be not able to access the higher level courses and be prepared for graduation, who has not received the full benefit of that high school. I think it's the system that needs to look at itself and see where they're going. The HSA, the high school assessments, I think peaked, and it was, I think, a very big hammer that was put forth, and it doesn't really help. I think, and maybe I might be old-fashioned on this, but I really think that you need to do the real teaching and learning over the 4 years, make sure that the student is taking the kind of courses they need to, and will have accumulated over the 4, perhaps 5 years, the kind of knowledge that they need to go on to college. We in Maryland just passed, for example, a law that we've been trying to pass for many years, which increases the mandatory age of attendance to 17, simply because we understand that some kids may need longer than 4 years to be able to get a high school diploma, and that's a good thing. I think it is a good thing to hold them to the higher standards, but we also have to provide them those higher standards and access to those higher level courses. If you look, and here I go back to my tracking, who's participating in the AP courses and in the international IBs, it's not these students, and you have to look down, 8th grade, 7th grade, 6th grade to see, are they taking preliminary algebra so that indeed they will be able to get into those more advanced courses? They're not. So it really, I think it needs to have the system look at itself and see the whole issue of equity. Is equity part of what we're doing? And we don't make that part of our assessment. Maybe we can do an equity counts review or analysis one of these days.
Other question? Over here?
Yes. Well, Wiley, Center for Applied Linguistics. Just first an observation. I think the expense of college obviously is a major problem, as we can see, on a number of respects in terms of saddling the next generation with debt, even if you can afford to get in, and the differential impact on poorer populations generally. But I would point out that the majority of even state universities now are increasingly less supported as a percentage of their operating budget, so many are only marginally state endorsed. So they're beginning to act like private universities, and going after international students is something that the private universities do as well. But I'd like to go back, even though it's only a smaller percentage of the population of children who are undocumented, but then a slightly larger percentage when at least one parent is undocumented, I think that we can see that we have a skewing in the national discourse for Latinos generally, whether or not they're born here or not, with the stigma that is being attached to that status. And we haven't had any discussion of the DREAM Act, so I just wonder if anyone could address that.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I only would comment on, I'm going to leave it to other colleagues to talk about the DREAM Act, but because they have been so good at it. But in terms of that skewing, I do think that in this discussion, that's one of the things that has compelled Excelencia to produce the kind of data that was cited of the number of U.S. citizens and permanent residents. Because on the practitioner level, the response by decision makers who appear not to want to do anything anyway, to say they can't do anything because we're all undocumented, that's something that on a practitioner level, community, we started to call people on that, so that, that there's much they could do and they don't. And then in terms of the DREAM Act, I'll leave that to others to comment on.
Well, let me talk about the Maryland DREAM Act, because we're really excited and proud that we passed the DREAM Act last legislative session. And it was the first positive policy towards immigrant students after a series of state after state limiting access to education. I think it's incredible and historically a first that we, as an American society, would be telling students, no, don't go on to college. We want to limit your access to higher education. That is what many states have done by limiting access to higher education. In Maryland, we were able to turn that around by passing really a rather simple bill that simply set the clock back to before 1996, when if you lived in a state and you paid taxes, you had access to in-state tuition. You paid the tuition of your university, which was corresponding to all the other students that had graduated from that high school. With a change in the federal law that told universities, if you receive federal dollars, you cannot recognize as an in-state resident someone who, even though they live in your state, graduate from your high school, is not documented. So those students, they can go to college, but they have to pay out-of-state tuition. And at the University of Maryland, it's a difference between $8,000 to $25,000. So it basically says, no, you can't go on to study, even if you're accepted, even if you've graduated and you've got all the credentials to be able to get accepted. Our law passed this time round. We had passed it back in 2003, and it was a pretty good, straightforward, vanilla in-state tuition law. This time, we've had to put so many bells and whistles to get it passed. They can't go to a 4-year university to start out. They have to only start out at a community college, complete the 32 credits or an associate's degree before they can apply to a 4-year college, even though there's enormous capacity within our state of Maryland for them to be able to go to other schools, except at the University of Maryland, our main campus. We've actually had to have them prove that they've been paying taxes all the time that they were in high school, and they will continue paying taxes all the time that they're in school. They have to promise to become a U.S. citizen as soon as they can. Well, I'm sure that that's not something that you're going to get resistant. Many restraints and conditions, but we were able to pass it. And then what happens is that the Tea Party that is now invading our Maryland legislature did a petition drive, and it's going to be up for referendum. The amount of misinformation about the DREAM Act, that this is somehow a benefit giveaway to illegal students, is the predominant way in which the general public is looking at this. So we're very challenged to look at how do we educate the general public so that indeed this law will be able to be maintained. That's the difficulty of a DREAM Act.
We're going to end with Raul just to talk to us about the long-stalled DREAM Act in the Congress and some of the alternatives that are floating around out there.
Oh, it's long stalled. I mean, there's really no viable alternative out there that's the real DREAM Act, that basically gives a child a chance to adjust his or her status and become a citizen, which is just the brass ring of any immigrant who's come to this country. And to change the dynamic we have as being an immigrant nation in order to pass legislation, it's sad. It's sad that we've been debating the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform for more than a decade and haven't been able to pass it. And the implications, I think there's a couple of implications that we should think about. One is directly related to these kids, which is, as Chris mentioned, there's a chilling effect on not just immigrants, but on Hispanics. U.S. citizen parents with their U.S. citizen children in Alabama left the state, okay? U.S. citizens. And so that's one aspect of a failure to have a federal policy here. The second is goes to the issue of federal role in education and ESEA. It seems like a long walk, but bear with me. Look, the fact that we need a federal role in education, and the reason why is people say, well, this is state imperative. But when we talk about states in education, we're not talking about teachers, principals, superintendents. We're talking about state legislatures. And the places in the map where we've seen the big growth, where we've seen real challenges in the graduation rates, are places that are also adopting through their legislature, not through their education system, these negative immigrant policies. And so the federal role is important because from a civil rights perspective, states are left to their own devices. We're not talking about educators here. Let's not conflate state with state education department.
Exactly.
We're talking about state legislatures that have shown aggressive hostility towards Hispanics. Very recently have had, in many of these places, a long history of aggressive hostility towards people of color, and have a long history since the time they prohibited people from teaching slaves to read, to separate but equal, mainly unequal, to massive resistance to Brown v. Board, a real resistance towards educating kids of color. And so we need to understand that's why the federal role is important. That's what we're talking about when we talk about what states, why states shouldn't be left to their own devices. And we see the failure of the DREAM Act to pass, spreading these anti-immigrant bills throughout the country, and we see the impact on U.S. citizens.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much. That concludes our panel discussion.
Good.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everyone. So I think this is a great way to end the morning program. We're going to transition into lunch now. So folks who are here in the room, it's going to be right outside. Folks who are at home, you're on your own. Although I did hear of a conference that had a virtual cocktail hour one time. I'm still not sure how that works. I think we'd have to upgrade our technology for that. So we will meet right back here at 1:30 in a half hour and get to the next part of the program. Thank you, everyone.